I'll marry the most impossible woman in this city. The words left Daniel Whitmore's mouth like a joke meant to disappear into the noise of the party. But within seconds the room around him went quiet enough that he could hear the faint clink of crystal glasses and the distant hum of traffic 15 floors below. Manhattan glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the rooftop lounge, the city lights stretching for miles like scattered stars. Daniel stood near the marble bar in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, calm and composed the way he always looked in magazines. Tech prodigy, self-made millionaire, CEO before 30. But tonight he looked mildly irritated, which was rare. His friend Marcus leaned against the bar with an amused grin. "You're serious?" he said. "You've been saying for years that you'll never get married." Daniel took a slow sip of sparkling water and shrugged. "Marriage isn't complicated. People make it complicated." Marcus laughed. "That's easy to say when every woman who meets you already knows your net worth." Around them the lounge buzzed with quiet luxury, soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers, waiters gliding between tables, investors and founders discussing deals worth millions of dollars like they were talking about the weather. Daniel had built his empire in rooms like this, rooms where confidence was currency and everyone pretended they had nothing to prove. Marcus gestured toward the door of the lounge. "All right then, Mr. Whitmore. Prove it. Marry the next woman who walks through that door." Daniel followed his gaze lazily, clearly not taking the challenge seriously. "Fine," he said after a moment, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "The next woman who walks in. I'll marry her." A few nearby guests overheard and chuckled, assuming it was just another rich guy joke meant to entertain the table for 5 seconds before everyone moved on. But the door opened, and the woman who stepped inside looked like she belonged to an entirely different version of New York. Scarlett Hayes walked into the lounge with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't care whether she impressed anyone in the room. She wore worn black boots, a dark leather jacket, and jeans instead of the elegant gown surrounding her. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her expression carried the kind of calm defiance that made people look twice. Without understanding why, she paused near the entrance for half a second, scanning the room as if deciding whether the place was worth her time. Then she walked straight toward the bar. Marcus nudged Daniel with his elbow. "There you go." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding. You made the bet." Scarlett reached the bar and asked the bartender for a soda like she had done it 1,000 times, completely unaware that half a dozen wealthy strangers were suddenly watching her. Daniel studied her carefully now, noticing the small details others might miss. The steady way she held herself, the faint ink smudge on the side of her hand like she had been drawing earlier, the fact that she looked completely unimpressed by the luxury around her. Marcus leaned closer. "Well," Daniel exhaled slowly, amused more than anything else. Then he stepped forward. Scarlett glanced at him with mild curiosity as he approached. "Hi," Daniel said calmly. "This might sound strange, but I'd like to ask you something." Scarlett tilted her head slightly. "That's usually a bad start." Daniel didn't smile. "Would you marry me?" For 2 seconds, she just stared at him like she was deciding whether he was joking. Then, unexpectedly, she crossed her arms and looked around the glittering room one more time before meeting his eyes again. "Is this some kind of rich people game?" Daniel answered honestly. "It started as one." Scarlett studied him another moment, as if weighing something invisible in her mind. The music continued playing softly. Glasses clinked somewhere behind them. Finally she shrugged. "Fine," she said. "I'll marry you." Marcus nearly choked on his drink. Daniel blinked once, surprised for the first time that night. Scarlett added one more sentence with a small, fearless smile. "But don't expect me to act like your perfect billionaire wife." And just like that, the craziest bet in Manhattan became real. Daniel Whitmore had closed billion-dollar deals with less chaos than the next 48 hours of his life. The morning after the bet, sunlight spilled across the quiet marble floors of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, but the calm view outside did not match the storm already forming across the internet. News moved fast in New York, especially when it involved a young tech millionaire doing something unpredictable. By 8:30 in the morning, several gossip blogs had already posted photos from the rooftop. Launched the night before. Daniel Whitmore proposes to mystery woman. Billionaire bet turns into engagement. Who is the rebellious girl who said yes? Daniel stood in his kitchen reading the headlines on his tablet, while the city, slowly woke up beneath the windows. He did not look worried, but his assistant Claire sounded far less calm as her voice came through the speakerphone. "Daniel, the board is asking questions," she said. "Investors are calling. They want to know if this is real." Daniel glanced across the room, where Scarlett Hayes sat at the long kitchen island, completely relaxed as if she had lived there for years. She wore the same leather jacket from the night before and had one foot hooked casually over the bar stool. Instead of looking impressed by the luxury apartment, she was studying a sketchbook that she had pulled from her bag. A pencil moved quickly across the page while she ignored the city skyline stretching behind her. Daniel answered Claire calmly. "Tell them it is real." There was a long pause on the phone. "You are serious." "Very." Scarlett looked up briefly, overhearing the conversation. "Sounds like you are about to give a lot of people a heart attack," she said. Daniel ended the call and set the tablet down. "You do realize that half of Manhattan believes you married me for money." Scarlett shrugged slightly and continued drawing. "That seems like their problem." Daniel walked closer and leaned against the counter. "Most people would have asked questions by now." Scarlett closed the sketchbook and slid it back into her bag. "I did ask one question," she said. "You said yes." Daniel studied her again, trying to understand the calm confidence she carried. Most people who stepped into his world were either impressed or intimidated. Scarlett appeared to be neither. "You are not curious about anything," he said. "The penthouse, the company, the press." Scarlett stood and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the park. Morning traffic was beginning to crawl along the avenues below. Yellow taxis looked like tiny pieces of color moving through gray streets. "I grew up 5 blocks from here," she said quietly. "Trust me, I have seen rich people before." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Yet you still agreed to marry one." Scarlett turned toward him again, her expression thoughtful but steady. "I said yes because you offered a deal. Without pretending it was romance," she said. "That is actually refreshing." Daniel folded his arms. "You think this is a deal?" "Of course it is." She walked back toward the island and grabbed her bag. "You get the image of a married billionaire. I get a temporary roof over my head." Daniel noticed something in her tone that suggested she was leaving something unsaid. "Temporary," he repeated. Scarlett nodded once. "I do not plan to live in your world forever." Daniel was about to respond when his tablet buzzed again with a notification from a financial news network. Investors were already debating whether his sudden marriage was a calculated move to stabilize the company before an upcoming merger. Daniel looked at the screen and then back at Scarlett. "You are surprisingly calm about this," he said. Scarlett slung the bag over her shoulder and headed toward the door. "That is because I am not here for your money or your reputation." Daniel watched her reach the elevator, still confused by the quiet mystery surrounding her. Just before the doors closed, Scarlett glanced back at him with the same fearless half-smile she had worn the night before. "I am just here for the opportunity," she said. And somehow that answer made Daniel Whitmore even more curious than the bet that started it all. 3 days after the unexpected wedding, Daniel Whitmore discovered that living with Scarlett Hayes was nothing like he imagined. The penthouse overlooking Central Park had always been quiet, almost perfectly controlled, the kind of place where every object seemed placed with intention and every morning followed the same precise rhythm. But Scarlett moved through the space like someone who refused to follow invisible rules. On Thursday morning, Daniel walked into the kitchen expecting his usual routine of coffee and financial reports, only to find the large windows wide open and cool autumn air drifting through the apartment. Scarlett stood near the counter pouring orange juice into a glass while sunlight spilled across the marble floor. She looked completely comfortable, wearing simple jeans and a loose sweater she had clearly pulled from her own bag rather than anything from the expensive wardrobe Daniel's assistant had arranged for her the day before. Daniel stopped for a moment and watched the scene as if it were a small puzzle he had not yet solved. "You turned down the stylist, Claire." "Sent," he said calmly. Scarlett glanced at him over the rim of the glass. "She brought 6 dresses that probably cost more than my entire apartment back home." "You live here now," Daniel replied. Scarlett smiled faintly. "Temporary roof, remember." Daniel poured himself coffee and studied her carefully. Most people who entered his life adjusted quickly to luxury. They asked questions about the cars, the art, the private events. Scarlett had done none of those things. Instead, she had spent the previous evening sketching quietly by the window while ignoring the television interview that discussed Daniel's sudden marriage. You are aware that half the city is analyzing our relationship right now, Daniel said. Scarlett shrugged lightly. People analyze everything in this city. Daniel leaned against the counter. You do not seem interested in taking advantage of the situation. Scarlett raised an eyebrow. You mean shopping, posting pictures, pretending I married you for a glamorous life? Daniel did not answer immediately. Scarlett set the empty glass down and grabbed the worn notebook from her bag. Daniel noticed it again. The same sketchbook she had carried since the night they met. The cover was bent slightly at the edges from use. Scarlett flipped it open and began drawing while standing at the kitchen island, as if the penthouse were simply another quiet cafe in the city. Daniel stepped closer, curiosity finally winning. What are you drawing? Scarlett tilted the page toward him for a brief second. Daniel expected fashion sketches or random doodles. Instead, he saw a detailed pencil drawing of a narrow street somewhere in lower Manhattan. Old brick buildings leaned slightly toward each other above a row of small shops. Fire escapes crossed the walls like ladders reaching toward the sky. In the corner of the drawing, several children sat on folding chairs holding paintbrushes. Daniel looked at the image longer than he expected. That does not look like Central Park, he said. Scarlett shook her head. It is not. Where is it? Scarlett hesitated for half a second before answering. Brooklyn. Daniel noticed the quiet pride in her voice when she said it. He leaned closer again, studying the careful lines of the drawing. You are good, he said honestly. Scarlett closed the notebook gently. It is just something I like doing. Daniel watched her slip the sketchbook back into her bag, as if the drawings inside were more personal than anything else she had shared. Outside the window, the city traffic continued its endless rhythm, horns echoing faintly between the buildings. Daniel realized something strange then. For the first time since their impulsive marriage, he was no longer thinking about investors, the board, or the headlines spreading across the internet. Instead, he was wondering a much simpler question. Who exactly had he married? Scarlett picked up her bag and headed toward the elevator again. Where are you going? Daniel asked. Scarlett pressed the button and looked back with that same fearless half-smile that seemed to follow her everywhere. To work, she said. Just because I married a millionaire does not mean I stop having a life. The elevator doors slid open and she stepped inside, leaving Daniel standing in the quiet kitchen with one new realization settling slowly in his mind. The woman he had married for a bet might be far more interesting than the bet itself. That evening, the headquarters of Whitmore Dynamics glowed like a tower of glass above Midtown Manhattan. Every floor filled with the quiet urgency of people who worked for one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. Daniel Whitmore stood at the long conference table in the executive boardroom, reviewing the final notes for a presentation scheduled the next morning. The upcoming merger with a California artificial intelligence firm was supposed to be the biggest announcement of the year, but instead of discussing innovation, the board had spent half the afternoon questioning his sudden marriage. The city skyline stretched beyond the massive windows while the last of the executives gathered their folders and slowly left the room. Daniel remained behind, studying the reflection of the lights across the polished table. He knew exactly what they were thinking. A billionaire making impulsive personal decisions could make investors nervous. Claire entered quietly with a tablet in her hands. You should see this, she said. Daniel looked up. More articles. More speculation, she corrected. She turned the screen toward him. A business news channel was already debating whether Scarlett Hayes had married him for publicity, money, or influence. Several commentators spoke confidently about a woman they had never met. Daniel watched the segment silently before handing the tablet back. They will get bored in a week. Claire hesitated. Unless they believe the story affects the merger. Daniel knew she was right. Reputation mattered in business almost as much as strategy. At that moment, the elevator doors at the far end of the executive floor opened, and Scarlett stepped out, as if she had walked into the building 100 times before. She had changed out of her leather jacket and now wore a simple dark coat, but the same calm independence followed her like a shadow. Claire blinked in surprise. I did not know she was coming. Daniel did not either. Scarlett walked across the quiet office floor looking around with mild curiosity. Rows of glass offices, digital displays glowing softly on the walls, engineers still working late behind computer screens. She finally stopped near the boardroom doorway and crossed her arms. So this is where the famous billionaire spends most of his time. Daniel gestured toward the empty conference chairs. You found the place easily. Scarlett shrugged. Your assistant downstairs seemed convinced that your wife belongs here. Claire coughed politely and stepped aside, leaving them alone. Scarlett walked slowly around the room, studying the massive screens and architectural models displayed along the wall. This building probably cost more than the entire neighborhood I grew up in, she said thoughtfully. Daniel leaned against the table. Does that bother you? Scarlett shook her head. Not really. She stopped in front of the main presentation screen, where a financial projection for the merger was still displayed. Scarlett read the numbers silently for a moment, then tilted her head slightly. Your problem is not the merger, she said calmly. Daniel frowned. You understand financial modeling. Scarlett smiled faintly. No, she pointed at the graph on the screen. But I understand people. Daniel looked at the projection again. Explain. Scarlett turned toward him with the same steady confidence she had carried since the night they met. Everyone in this city already believes your marriage was a calculated move, she said. So stop trying to deny it. Daniel folded his arms. You think I should confirm their theory? Scarlett nodded once. Turn the story around. Make the marriage part of the strategy instead of pretending it is a mistake. Daniel stared at her for several seconds, realizing she had just summarized the exact argument his public relations team had been debating all afternoon. You are surprisingly good at this, he said slowly. Scarlett walked toward the door again and picked up her bag. I told you, she said lightly. Just because I pour drinks for a living does not mean I do not watch how powerful people behave. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. Just before the doors closed, she glanced back at him again with that same fearless half-smile. You might be a millionaire, she added, but you still have a lot to learn about how the world actually works. The elevator doors slid shut and Daniel stood alone in the quiet boardroom, realizing something he had not expected when he made the bet days earlier. Scarlett Hayes might be the only person in the entire building who was not impressed by his success, and somehow that made her advice more valuable than anything his executives had said all day. 2 nights later, Manhattan was glowing under a clear autumn sky when Daniel Whitmore arrived at the Grand Crescent Hotel for the annual Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, an event that attracted investors, politicians, and nearly every influential name in the city. The ballroom shimmered with warm golden light reflecting off crystal chandeliers, while a live jazz trio played softly near the stage. Cameras flashed near the entrance as guests stepped onto the red carpet, and reporters whispered eagerly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the billionaire whose sudden marriage had become the most discussed topic in financial news. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and stepped out of the car, already prepared for the attention. But what he was not prepared for was Scarlett Hayes stepping out beside him. For a brief moment, even the photographers paused. Scarlett was wearing a deep midnight blue dress that Claire had convinced her to try earlier that afternoon, elegant yet simple, paired with the same calm confidence she carried everywhere she went. She did not look like someone overwhelmed by the wealth surrounding her. Instead, she looked like someone quietly observing it. Daniel glanced at her as flashes of light surrounded them. You clean up well, he said quietly. Scarlett smirked slightly. Do not get used to it. Inside, the ballroom conversation slowed as people noticed the couple walking through the room. Investors whispered to each other, socialites exchanged curious looks, and a few journalists immediately began typing on their phones. Daniel could almost hear the questions forming in the air. Who is she? Where did she come from? Is the marriage real? Scarlett noticed the attention but did not appear nervous. She moved beside Daniel with steady composure, occasionally nodding politely when someone greeted them. At one point, a wealthy donor approached with a polite but clearly skeptical smile. Mr. Whitmore, the man said, glancing briefly at Scarlett. Congratulations on the recent wedding. Quite the surprise for all of us. Daniel responded calmly. Life can be unpredictable. The donor turned to Scarlett. And what exactly do you do, Mrs. Whitmore? The question carried just enough curiosity to make nearby guests listen more closely. Scarlett held the man's gaze without hesitation. Right now, she answered evenly. I am learning how this world works. A few people nearby chuckled politely, but Daniel noticed something else. Scarlett was studying the room carefully, as if reading every subtle interaction happening around them. Later in the evening, Daniel stepped away briefly to speak with several investors near the stage. When he returned a few minutes later, Scarlett was no longer beside the table where he had left her. He He scanned the crowd and finally spotted her across the ballroom, near a display showing the Foundation's community programs. A group of donors had gathered around the exhibit, discussing plans to expand art funding in public schools. Scarlett stood quietly among them, listening. One of the donors noticed her and smiled politely. "Do you work in education?" the woman asked. Scarlett shook her head gently. "No." She glanced at the photographs of children painting murals displayed on the board. "But I know how much art programs can change a neighborhood." The donors leaned in slightly, curious now. Scarlett began speaking about small community studios in Brooklyn, where children spent afternoons learning to draw instead of wandering the streets. Her voice was calm but passionate, and soon the entire group was listening closely. Daniel watched from across the room, surprised by how naturally she held their attention. Within minutes, the donors were discussing ways to support new art workshops across the city. When Scarlett finally noticed Daniel watching, she walked back toward him with that same relaxed confidence. "You were supposed to blend in," Daniel said quietly. Scarlett shrugged with a small smile. "I tried." Daniel glanced toward the donors who were still discussing her idea. For the first time that evening, he realized something unexpected. Scarlett Hayes was not just surviving in his world. Somehow, without even trying, she was starting to change it. The city was quiet when Daniel Whitmore returned to the penthouse that night, but his mind was anything but calm. The charity gala had ended hours earlier, yet Scarlett Hayes's words about community art programs were still echoing in his thoughts. Most people at those events spoke carefully, measuring every sentence to impress donors or secure influence. Scarlett had done the opposite. She had spoken simply, honestly, and somehow the entire room had listened. Daniel stepped inside the apartment and loosened his tie, expecting to find the living room empty. Instead, he noticed a soft light coming from the balcony. Scarlett was sitting outside wrapped in a light sweater, her sketchbook resting on the small table beside her. The skyline of Manhattan stretched across the horizon like a sea of quiet lights, while the distant hum of traffic drifted up from the streets below. Daniel paused in the doorway for a moment before stepping outside. "You left the gala early," he said. Scarlett did not look surprised to see him. "Those events get loud after midnight," she replied. Daniel leaned against the balcony railing beside her. "You impressed several donors tonight." Scarlett gave a small shrug. "I was just telling the truth." Daniel noticed the sketchbook again and nodded toward it. "You carry that everywhere." Scarlett hesitated for a moment before opening it. She flipped past several pages filled with pencil drawings of city streets, corner shops, and small parks scattered throughout Brooklyn. Daniel studied the details carefully. Each drawing showed children painting murals or sitting with art supplies in simple classrooms. The scenes felt alive in a way that made the pages almost look like photographs. "These are not random sketches," Daniel said quietly. Scarlett rested her hand on the edge of the notebook. "No." She turned to one page showing an old warehouse building with large windows and colorful murals painted across the brick walls. A group of children stood outside holding paintbrushes and canvases. "This used to be an abandoned building near where I grew up," she explained softly. "A local teacher turned it into a free art studio for kids." Daniel looked closer. "Used to be." Scarlett nodded slowly. "The building was sold last year. The studio closed." Daniel could hear the quiet disappointment in her voice. Scarlett closed the notebook gently. "That place kept a lot of kids out of trouble," she said. "Sometimes a room with paint and pencils can change a life." Daniel thought about the donors at the gala discussing new funding ideas and suddenly realized something important. "Is that why you talked about art programs tonight?" he asked. Scarlett smiled faintly. "Maybe." Daniel watched her for a long moment. The woman he had married on a bet was no longer just an unpredictable stranger. There was a purpose behind the sketches, behind the quiet confidence she carried into rooms full of powerful people. "You could have asked me to fund something like that," Daniel said. Scarlett shook her head immediately. "I did not marry you to ask for favors." The answer came so quickly and sincerely that Daniel did not doubt it for a second. For the first time since their impulsive wedding, he felt something unfamiliar growing in his mind. Respect. Scarlett stood and walked to the balcony railing, looking out across the glowing city lights. "New York has plenty of people with money," she said quietly. "What it needs are people who remember where they came from." Daniel followed her gaze across the skyline and realized that somewhere along the way the woman he married for a bet had started teaching him something he had forgotten long ago. The next morning, Manhattan woke beneath a pale gray sky, the kind that made the city feel quieter than usual. Inside the Whitmore Dynamics headquarters, the atmosphere was far less calm. By 9 o'clock, several financial news networks were already broadcasting a new story, and this time Daniel Whitmore was not the only one being discussed. Scarlett Hayes' name had suddenly appeared across headlines that spread through social media faster than any corporate announcement. Daniel stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, just as Claire hurried toward him with an expression that told him something had gone wrong. "You need to see this immediately," she said, handing him her tablet. Daniel read the article displayed on the screen while the quiet office around them continued its normal rhythm. The headline was written in bold letters. Mystery wife of billionaire Daniel Whitmore linked to controversial incident in Brooklyn. Daniel's eyes moved quickly through the article. The story described an argument that had happened 2 years earlier outside a bar in Brooklyn where Scarlett had worked at the time. A blurry video clip had been posted online showing Scarlett confronting a wealthy investor who had visited the neighborhood. The article did not explain the situation clearly, but the comments beneath the video told a different story. Some viewers accused Scarlett of being reckless and unstable. Others claimed the billionaire had married someone with a questionable past. Daniel lowered the tablet slowly. "Where did this come from?" Claire shook her head. "The source is anonymous, but several media outlets picked it up within the hour." Daniel already understood the implication. In the world of corporate competition, reputation was currency, and someone had just attempted to damage his. Across the city, Scarlett Hayes was unaware of the storm spreading across the internet. She was standing inside a small coffee shop in Brooklyn waiting for her usual order while morning commuters hurried past the windows. The television above the counter suddenly switched to a financial news channel. Scarlett glanced up briefly and froze when she saw her own photograph appear beside Daniel's name. The news anchor spoke calmly about questions surrounding the background of the billionaire's new wife. Scarlett lowered her eyes quietly. She had known this moment might come eventually. News about people like Daniel Whitmore rarely stayed simple for long. By the time she returned to the penthouse later that afternoon, the city already seemed to be watching her differently. Several reporters stood near the entrance of the building, hoping to catch a statement. Scarlett slipped past them silently and rode the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, Daniel was already waiting in the living room, the tablet still resting on the table beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt heavier than usual. Scarlett set her bag down slowly. "You saw it," she said. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Scarlett looked toward the large windows where the city skyline stretched endlessly across the horizon. "The article does not explain everything," she said quietly. Daniel studied her expression carefully. He could see the calm strength she always carried, but now there was also something else behind it. Worry. Scarlett turned back toward him. "If this causes problems for your company," she continued softly, "I understand if you want to end the arrangement early." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window and looked out across the city that had built his fortune. For the first time since their impulsive marriage, he realized that the bet he had made days earlier had turned into something far more complicated than a simple challenge. When he finally turned back toward Scarlett, his voice was steady but serious. "Before I make any decisions," he said quietly, "I want to hear the real story." And for the first time since they met, Scarlett Hayes looked uncertain about what would happen next. Scarlett stood quietly in the center of the penthouse living room, the late afternoon sunlight stretching across the floor while the city buzzed far below the windows. Daniel Whitmore watched her carefully, waiting, sensing that whatever she was about to say mattered far more than the headlines spreading across the internet. Scarlett took a slow breath before finally speaking. 2 years ago, I worked at a small bar in Brooklyn, she began calmly. It was the kind of place where artists and musicians came after midnight because it was one of the few spaces that stayed open late and did not ask too many questions. Daniel listened without interrupting. Scarlett walked slowly toward the balcony doors, her eyes drifting briefly across the skyline before she continued. "One night a wealthy investor showed up with a group of friends," she said. "They were loud, confident, the kind of people who believed money made them important everywhere they went." Her voice remained steady but thoughtful. "A teenage girl who came to our art studio nearby had been helping clean tables that night for extra money. She was shy but talented, and the studio meant everything to her. Daniel could already guess where the story was heading, but he let Scarlett finish in her own time. The investors started bothering her, Scarlett said quietly. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of behavior people often ignore because it is easier than speaking up. Scarlett looked down briefly before meeting Daniel's eyes again. I told him to leave her alone. Daniel folded his arms, but said nothing. Scarlett gave a small shrug. The video online only shows the argument that happened afterward. It does not show the part where he was making the girl uncomfortable for half an hour before that. The quiet room seemed heavier after she finished speaking. Outside the windows, helicopters moved slowly across the skyline, while the city carried on with its endless rhythm. Daniel finally stepped closer. And the girl, he asked. What happened to her? Scarlett smiled faintly, the first hint of relief appearing in her expression. She kept going to the art studio for another year until the building was sold. Daniel understood immediately. The same studio she had drawn in her sketchbook. The same one she had spoken about on the balcony days earlier. That is why the story matters to you, he said. Scarlett nodded. People in power sometimes forget that small places like that can change someone's future. Daniel looked at the tablet still resting on the table where the article remained open. The headline made the situation look reckless and dramatic, but the truth Scarlett described felt completely different. Scarlett crossed her arms gently. Now you know the full story, she said quietly. If it damages your company, I understand if you need distance. Daniel studied her expression for several seconds, noticing how she stood calmly, even though the entire city seemed to be judging her without understanding what really happened. Finally, he picked up the tablet and closed the article. The media story is incomplete, he said. Scarlett looked surprised. Daniel walked toward the window and glanced across the skyline. Tomorrow morning, I will explain the truth. Scarlett blinked slightly. You do not have to defend me. Daniel turned back toward her with a calm certainty she had not seen before. I am not defending you, he said quietly. I am correcting the narrative. Scarlett watched him for a moment, realizing that something had shifted between them. The man who married her for a bet was no longer just observing her life from a distance. He was choosing a side. The next morning, the glass atrium of Whitmore Dynamics filled with reporters long before the official press conference was scheduled to begin. Cameras lined the marble floor and journalists whispered to each other while waiting for Daniel Whitmore to address the growing controversy surrounding his marriage. Outside the building, the streets of Midtown Manhattan were already crowded with commuters, but inside the lobby, every conversation seemed to circle around the same question. Who was Scarlett Hayes, and why had the billionaire chosen her? Upstairs in the executive conference room, Daniel adjusted the cuff of his jacket, while Claire reviewed the final notes for the announcement. Once you walk out there, the story changes, she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. That is the plan. Across the room, Scarlett stood near the window, looking down at the city streets 30 floors below. She had insisted on attending, even though Daniel had offered to handle the situation alone. The morning sunlight reflected across the glass towers surrounding the building, while the distant sound of traffic drifted upward through the quiet air. Scarlett turned toward him slowly. You do not have to do this publicly, she said. The story will fade eventually. Daniel shook his head. If people are going to talk about our marriage, they should at least hear the truth. A few minutes later, the doors to the atrium opened and Daniel stepped onto the stage while cameras immediately flashed. Scarlett remained near the side of the room, watching quietly as the reporters leaned forward with microphones ready. Daniel began calmly, explaining the situation in clear and direct terms. He spoke about the articles circulating online and the incomplete story that had been presented. Then he described what had really happened that night in Brooklyn and why Scarlett had chosen to speak up for someone who needed help. The room grew noticeably quieter as the reporters listened. What had started as a scandal now sounded very different when the full story was told. When Daniel finished speaking, a journalist raised a hand. Mr. Whitmore, the reporter asked carefully, are you saying your marriage had nothing to do with publicity or strategy? Daniel glanced briefly toward Scarlett, standing near the edge of the crowd before answering. When we met, it began as a challenge, he admitted honestly. A few reporters exchanged surprised looks, but Daniel continued before they could interrupt. But sometimes the most unexpected decisions teach you something important. The room waited as he spoke his next words slowly and clearly. Scarlett Hayes reminds people like me that success means very little if you forget the communities that shaped you. Across the atrium, Scarlett felt a quiet warmth rise in her chest as she realized Daniel was not just protecting her reputation. He was acknowledging the values she carried with her long before they met. Later that afternoon, the headlines spreading across the internet looked very different from the ones that had appeared the day before. Instead of scandal, they described a story about integrity and unexpected partnership. By sunset, the penthouse overlooking Central Park was peaceful again. Scarlett stood on the balcony watching the lights of the city slowly flicker on while Daniel stepped beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "The media seems satisfied for now," he said lightly. Scarlett accepted the cup and smiled faintly. "You handled it well." Daniel leaned against the railing beside her, looking out across the skyline that had shaped both of their lives in different ways. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and unfolded a single sheet of paper. Scarlett recognized it instantly. It was the agreement they had signed days earlier, the document that turned a reckless bet into a legal marriage. Daniel looked at it for a second before tearing it cleanly in half and letting the pieces fall into the recycling bin beside the door. Scarlett raised an eyebrow in surprise. Daniel met her gaze with a quiet smile. "If we are going to continue this marriage," he said calmly, "it should not be based on a bet." The city lights stretched endlessly around them while the evening breeze drifted across the balcony. Scarlett studied his expression for a moment before finally nodding. For the first time since the night they met, neither of them felt like they were playing a role anymore.